This is the goal in the Daniel dilemma. We want to stand true and keep our convictions and have influence at the same time. Daniel and his men had the courage to stand up for what their convictions were. They didn't allow culture to dictate who they were or what they would do. When culture challenges our convictions, we too must exercise courage, that deep-seated strength of heart, and resist the temptation to conform or compromise. We're diving into an exciting series that addresses an important topic for the times we're living in. So let me begin with a question. How many of you have felt like it's harder and harder to stand up for your faith? I mean, how many of you have faced conversations that have challenged your faith and you really weren't quite sure how to react? Well, today we're talking about Daniel and the dilemma he faced as a man of faith living in an ungodly Babylonian culture. So by studying how he handled certain challenges, we can get an idea of how to engage in our own culture without compromising our faith. Let me set the stage for you. Several generations after the reign of King David and King Solomon, the tribes of Israel had drifted from their faith. God had sent them multiple warnings. And by the way, God usually does this when he sees us going down the wrong path. He urged them to do a U-turn, but they were caught up in their own selfish desires and pride and really refused to heed the warnings. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? And just as God warned, their path led them to their downfall. And that's where we first find Daniel in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. Let's look at it. In the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of the court officials, to bring some of the Israelites, some from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to teach and serve in the king's palace. And he was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. This was Daniel's new reality, a captive of this new culture. But as we see in this series, no matter how the culture around him shifted, Daniel remained true to who he was and the God he served. His example is one we can learn to emulate in our lives today. And if you haven't noticed, I'm sure you have, our culture is shifting. And this raises the question, how can we remain anchored in our Christian faith when culture shifts? Do we just let go and go with the flow? Do we fight against it? Or is there another strategy? But before we answer these questions, we first have to identify our culture's riptides. We have to know what dangers to look out for, and it begins with our names and what the enemy is trying to make us believe about ourselves. The names you allow to label you often dictate what you live out. This explains why the number one goal of the enemy, the devil, is to attack your identity. He wants to give you a different name, one that stands in direct contrast to the name God gave you when he created you. I wonder if you've ever heard this line, live your own truth. And this has become a bumper sticker mantra for generations conditioned to believe that they are entitled to reinvent themselves and live any way they choose. But the truth is, we don't have the privilege of defining ourselves or redefining ourselves. There are limits to how far we can reinvent ourselves. Why? Because we've already been defined by God, our Creator. God knows who he made each of us to be. And let me tell you, his design is always better than what we could come up with on our own. Now, Daniel understood this at the core. His faith in God tethered him to it throughout all of his time in captivity, steeped in a culture that elevated sensual pleasure, idol worship, moral decadence. The Babylonians focused on a lot of things other than God. They tried to pull Daniel and his fellow captives into their lifestyle by casting shadows on their identities. So the first strategy was to rename them. Let's look at it in Daniel chapter 1, verse 7. It says, the chief official gave them new names to Daniel, the name Belteshazzar, and then to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, this is the first thing that happens when culture shifts, and that is a desire to rename us. Now, it was customary in those days to change the names of any captive as a sign of ownership. These Babylonian names weren't simply different names. These new names were meant to change the Israelites' identities. Daniel's name, which meant God is my judge, was changed to Belteshazzar, which means lady, protect the king. They literally changed Daniel's gender and removed God from his name. They changed Hananiah, which means Yahweh has been gracious, to Shadrach, I am fearful of God. So the Babylonians inverted the focus from God being good to God being bad. Now, this new name echoed with the kind of fear you'd feel standing before a tyrant or a monster. Mishael means, who can compare to my God? No one. And it was changed to Meshach, which means I am despised, contemptible, and humiliated. Once again, the Babylonians chose a name that subverted the goodness of God in our relationship to him, and it shifted the focus from our confidence in God to cowardice. Azariah, which means Yahweh has helped, was changed to Abednego, the servant of Nebo. Azariah went from being a son or heir of Yahweh, the living God, a term of endearment, to being a slave of another man. So Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were subjected to new names that rejected the truth about who God is and who they were in light of that truth. And today, we still see the enemy looking for opportunities to cast confusion on God's goodness and our identities. We have an entire generation unsure of who they are, where they come from, or where they're going. Things that were once inherent to who we have become now have become flexible and up for debate. Our culture claims these qualities can be shaped to suit what a person wants with no regard to God's original design. But you and I know this is not true. God created us on purpose, with a purpose, with intrinsic value that cannot be taken away. It reminds me of this story of a man who bought a painting of a magnolia branch for less than nothing to hang over a hole in his wall. The painting remained there for years, disguising the damage. No one paid much attention to it. Then one day the owner happened to see the image of a famous painting that looked oddly similar to the one he had hanging. So he had his painting assessed by someone who knew the true value of art. The man was shocked when he learned that what he had considered a cheap flower painting covering a hole in his wall was actually a famous painting worth more than the house itself. But it took someone who knew the value of that painting to identify it for what it really was, a masterpiece. The truth is, our identities shift when we value the opinion of those looking at the art more than the artist who created it. We can't let culture define who we are. Scripture tells us, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. You are who God made you to be. You are unique, a beloved child of God. You are redeemed, loved, chosen. You're not an accident. You're a masterpiece, valued and named by the creator of the universe. You have a unique purpose for your life that no one else has or ever will have. You are adopted into the family of God. This is your true identity. So we've seen how one of Satan's tactics is to use culture to rename us in order to confuse our identity, right? He tries to do this with Daniel and his friends, and he's still using the same strategy today. The next strategy, though, is to tame us. Now, we see this when Daniel and his friends were assigned a portion from the king's table. This is Daniel chapter 1, verse 5. Let's look at it. It says, the king assigned a daily ration for them from his finest food and from the wine which he drank. They were to be educated and nourished in this way for 3 years, so that at the end of that time, they would be prepared to enter the king's service. So not only was the food that they were offered against the Jewish dietary restrictions, the dietary laws, but much of the food had been offered up into idol worship before it had been given to them. Now, The Jewish law forbade them from eating anything offered to idols. You might be thinking, come on, eating from the king's table doesn't really sound so bad. What's the big deal? I mean, maybe the king was just being hospitable to these new guys. Now, though it may seem innocent enough on the surface, it was really being used to chip away at their identity and their convictions, because the king's food didn't allow Jewish dietary law. They would have to compromise their standards in order to eat it. Now, the enemy constantly invites us to compromise our standards, to take a seat at his table of temptations. He'll lure you into the forbidden, appeal to your flesh, and make you think it's actually good for you, good for your career, good for your popularity, good for your finances, your relationships, or maybe even your future. You know, one of the biggest lies that the enemy uses is, it's not as bad as fill in the blank. You know, eating food offered to an idol isn't as bad as bowing down to the idol, or not talking about our faith isn't as bad as denouncing your faith. Watching this movie isn't as bad as fill in the blank. After all, eating from the king's table wasn't as bad as starving in prison, in a prison cell. But Daniel was not willing to violate his conscience or his beliefs. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, we read, Daniel resolved, it's a key word, not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. The enemy will use all kinds of enticements to pull you away from God's plan, to lessen your impact, to try to tame you. He'll make them seem easy and enjoyable and no big deal. And that's why you have to know what you stand for before that moment even comes. And when you're offered that hit or that drink or that touch or that glimpse or that purchase or that taste, you have to pre-decide what you're going to do when those temptations come your way, because they will definitely come your way. When culture shifts, we must reaffirm our convictions. Let's look at Daniel chapter 1, verses 9 through 10. It says, now Daniel had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants. I want you to remember that. Test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. Now, knowing and holding to our convictions is what allows us to stand firm when culture shifts all around us. Now, convictions are important because they require you to decide what's right ahead of time. They're not based on what feels good or seems right at the time or in the moment. They won't hold us when we're getting pummeled by the shifting waves of culture. No, our convictions must be the immovable foundation upon which we build our lives. Now, that doesn't mean we need to be mean or judgmental when we share them with others. That is never the right way to handle things. Why? Because God calls us to show love to everyone, even if we disagree with them. But we do need to be sure of our convictions so we can confidently stand firm in them when that test comes. I remember when I was in college at LSU, go Tigers. I was actually working at the LSU Law School where my mom worked, and I was working in the maintenance department to, make some money while I was a student at LSU. And most of the guys working with me were, just good old boys, kind of proud rednecks who smoked a little and drank and cussed and made jokes, about quiet Christian boys like me who brought my Bible to work to read on breaks. One day, one of their buddies from the campus police force came by and visited that office. His name was Muhammad, and he was a big guy who immediately joined in the jokes with the other guys when he saw me reading my Bible. And he came up to me and he said, I don't think you really believe everything that's in that Bible. I don't think you really do. And I said, well, yeah, I do. Actually, I believe if it's in here, I actually really do believe it. He goes, no, you don't. You don't believe it. And I said, well, no, I really do. And he says, no, when push comes to shove, I can prove to you that you really don't believe this. I said, I really do. And he actually stood up and he walked over to me, and I actually thought he was going to show me a verse that was kind of the gotcha verse, the verse I just didn't know was there. And so I thought he was going to show me a verse I just wasn't aware of. And he came over and walked over to me, and I'm looking down at my Bible, just thinking he's getting ready to show me this verse, when all of a sudden he slaps the fire out of my face. And it shocked me so much. I put my hand in my face. I said, Muhammad, why did you do that? And he grabbed my Bible and he goes, if you believe this Bible, turn the other cheek. And I was really shocked. I'm like, are you serious? He goes, yeah, if you really believe this, turn the other cheek. And at this point, he's convinced I'm not going to turn the other cheek. I said, well, if that's what you need, go ahead, hit me. Go ahead. He goes, no, you don't believe it. I said, yes, I do. He goes, no, you don't believe me. I said, hit me. And at this point, I don't think he's going to hit me. And he hit me again. It wasn't as hard the first time. But I'll never forget, he took his cap off. And he said, I think I've met the first real Christian. And I was thinking, do you go around slapping people? That encounter became the beginning of a friendship that lasted for a long time. In fact, I was able to share my faith with Muhammad. Muhammad came by during his breaks every day, asked about my faith, asked about Jesus, asked about what it meant to be a Christian and to turn the other cheek. He actually ended up giving his life to Jesus. This little incident is nothing, by the way, compared to the persecution so many Christians face every single day all around the world. But in my moment, my testing moment, I was forced to choose whether or not to live out my faith. Listen to me, God will use the tests in our lives to make our faith stronger and to reveal his glory to those around us. Look at what happened next with Daniel and his friends as they held the line of their faith. This is Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 15. It says, at the end of the 10 days of testing, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the other young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine that they were given to drink and gave them vegetables instead. They followed God's way. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them and found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. What does that mean? That means they passed the test with flying colors, and God rewarded them with knowledge and understanding and favor. The king was so impressed, he even asked them to join his inner circle. And this is the goal in the Daniel dilemma. We want to stand true and keep our convictions and have influence at the same time. Daniel and his men had the courage to stand up for what their convictions were. They didn't allow culture to dictate who they were or what they would do. When culture challenges our convictions, we too must exercise courage, that deep-seated strength of heart, and resist the temptation to conform or compromise. Now, where does our courage to stand strong in the face of culture come from? It's a great question. And it's the same place that Daniel's courage came from, Abraham's, Paul's. It comes from the presence of God and the Word of God. When we know who we are and we know what His Word says, we will more readily recognize the strategies of Satan and be able to stand strong.